Chapter 19 of The Wonderful Flight to the Mushroom Planet. Like a leaf in the sky. 5 minutes later, they drew up outside Mr. Bass's house. And what a chaos the storm had made of his garden. As in many other gardens they had passed, leaves and pine needles were everywhere. Thick along the paths and sidewalks, in drifts in the gutters, and even pasted flat against the windows. Branches were torn down, and a little new tree at the side of Mr. Bass's gate had been entirely uprooted. Out they got, David leading the way with Captain Tom and Mrs. Topman next in single file. David opened the gate, and with a quick beating heart, for now already, he was beginning to wonder if he ever really had seen Mr. Bass at all. Scuffed his way along the strewn and littered path. How quiet everything was now that the storm was over. Mr. Bass's house was so buried in trees that you felt, as you drew near it, as if you were completely shut away from the hustle of the town. And indeed, you might have been in the middle of a wood. Now a bird piped a single questioning note, and off somewhere in the underbrush there was a quick rustle, as of some small animal running to hide. But not a sound came from the little house. Not a shred of smoke curled from the chimney. There was not a movement at the windows. Now, curiously fearful, David went up the front steps, held out his hand, hesitated, then doubled his fist over and knocked. His mother and Captain Tom stood quietly behind him, but there was no answer. "Try again," said Captain Tom. So David knocked 2 more knocks, quite loud, but still no answer. "Well," said Mrs. Topman, as she sounded as if she were trying to be perfectly reasonable and ordinary, "that's a funny thing. But he may have gone to do some marketing. Suppose we try round the back, or maybe he's down the cellar." So they all trooped round to the side of the house, peered into the dark where only the little mushroom heads gleamed palely, and then went round to the back. But there was no answer there either. "But he asked us specially to be here at 10 o'clock on the dot," wailed David. "Dear," said Mrs. Topman, and she sounded distinctly annoyed. "I do think he might have left a note." But suddenly David gave an exclamation and pointed a finger at the window on the back porch. "I saw that curtain move," he cried. So up the back steps they hurried again, and once more David knocked. Still no answer. And at this point, Captain Tom held up his hand with authority. "There's more here," he said, "than meets the eye. Wait, and I will go round to larboard and inquire of the natives. Only sensible procedure." And he was just about to go when the back door opened, and from the dimness inside there peered out an eye. "Hi," said someone. "You looking for Mr. Bass?" The voice came from rather low down, and it sounded as if it belonged to a person somewhat younger than David. "Why, yes, dear," exclaimed Mrs. Topman eagerly. "As it happens, we are. Have you seen him about—" Now the head of a small boy of about 6 appeared. "I did this morning," said he, "but he blew away." There was a moment of stunned silence. "Blew away?" burst out Captain Tom at last. "Great jumpin' Jehoshaphat! What was that you said? Blow away?" "Yes, sir," said the little boy respectfully, but in a perfectly matter-of-fact voice. "My mom let me phone the radio station, and I told 'em. He blew away. I saw him. I looked out of my window when the wind was really getting strong, and I saw Mr. Bass go up in the air like a leaf in the sky." Here the little boy made an upward, fluttering movement of his hand. "And that was the last of him. After it stopped raining, I came over here to look for him. I looked in his in his observatory, and in the closets, and under the bed, and behind the curtains, and down in the cellar, and everywhere. But he's gone. He blew away all right." There was another moment of profound silence. "Are you sure this is true?" asked Captain Tom sternly after a bit. "Yes, sir," said the little boy. "My mom just laughed, but she said I could phone anyway. She thinks Mr. Bass is going to come back, but he won't." "Did she say, too, that you might have been dreaming?" asked Mrs. Topman anxiously. Yes, said the little boy. I was afraid of that, said Mrs. Topman. And of course you weren't. Did you like Mr. Bass a lot? Oh, yes, he was wonderful. You should see the things he made for me. You couldn't ever buy him at a store. Stores wouldn't think of things like Mr. Bass could make. And will you be sad, that is, said Mrs. Topman hastily. Will you miss Mr. Bass? Why, sure, said the little boy, as if anybody with a lick of sense would know that. Of course I'll miss him. But he's gone on an adventure, and it'll be fun. He'll have a wonderful time. And he always said he'd blow away sometime because he's a spore person. Mr. Bass told me that. Everybody stood around in a circle and just looked at the little boy because they couldn't think of a single thing to say. But then, all at once, Jimmy, came a voice from over in the next garden. There's my mum, he said, and as quick as a rabbit, he scuttled off down the stairs and away through the bushes. After he was gone, not a leaf moved, not a bird piped. There wasn't a sound anywhere. Well, said Captain Tom, a spore person. By the great white whale, only thing to do now is to have a look around. Might find something. Stands to reason we'll find something. Have an idea Mr. Bass wouldn't mind. So in they went, even though David felt he could not bear to go into that empty little house now that Mr. Bass was gone. Blown away, of course. It was just like him. It seemed to David that that was just exactly how Mr. Bass would go somewhere. But not now. Not today of all days. Why would he have let himself be blown away just when he should have been waiting to hear how everything had turned out? He's got to be here, Mom. He's got to be somewhere. But he wasn't. He wasn't in the closet, nor under the bed, nor in the kitchen, nor under the sofa, nor behind the curtains, nor down the cellar, nor up in the observatory. He just wasn't anywhere. By golly, they heard Captain Tom chuckle to himself out in the little kitchen. Neat and clean and snug as a ship's galley. All the pots and pans shining and all the cutlery in place. Oh dear, said Mrs. Topman, coming away from peeking into Mr. Bass's bedroom. I wonder if we should take the liberty of coming into someone else's house and looking into all the corners. It seems impolite somehow. But when she saw the steps leading to the observatory, she seemed suddenly overcome with the delight of exploring. Though of course, she said to David, who had already gone aloft and was looking down at her, on the other hand, if Mr. Bass is really gone, and she climbed up with Captain Tom crowding after. In the observatory, which they filled to the walls, Captain Tom being, after all, quite a large man, they stared all around at Mr. Bass's enormous collection of books, his instruments of celestial exploration, and the curious domed, ridged ceiling above them. And did the others feel as he himself felt, wondered David, something extraordinary here in Mr. Bass's little house, something waiting? Oh, it's no use, David, I'm afraid, said Mrs. Topman at last in a low voice, as though she didn't want to be overheard. We might just as well give up and go home. We'll have to be content with biding our time until Mr. Bass chooses to appear again. But David did not follow when the other two filed down the steps. Where are you, Mr. Bass? He asked the eerie, gray morning stillness that filled that small room. Where have you gone? Please come back. And then, as if in answer, there came a muffled exclamation from the depths of Mr. Bass's house, and the sound of scurrying feet. In less than a breath, David was down the observatory steps and into the living room, while down cellar could be heard the happy boom of Captain Tom's voice, and a sharp cry of excitement from Mrs. Topman. What? Yelled David at the top of his lungs on his way round to the cellar door. What is it? Wait for me.